Hey Alana, how do you personally define authenticity for you?
I think that it's probably been a journey over the course of my career. I think when I started out, I probably defined it as, um, I don't know, just like having a personality, not becoming like a weird MBA robot type. And it was just what I was exposed to, right? I was just like, I came in and I was someone who was just gritty and making it and teaching themselves. And so to me, authenticity was somehow showing your real personality, admitting the struggle, right? Always just making everything sound polished and perfect. I think as I've become a leader, I think over time I realized how much it was also about sharing things about you and listening to things about other people and not just going like straight into business, straight into problem solving. And that authenticity ended up being this aspect of like, oh, we are still humans in the room. It isn't just about personality and what you say, it's also about how you relate. And I think that took a little bit of time to realize, just as I was becoming a manager and leader, that people do need that piece. And if they don't get that piece, they don't trust you. And you'll see that manifest in lots of ways over time.
Who would be a role model of yours who exemplifies authenticity, specifically from a tech background? And what specific qualities about them and how they lead which showed up for you?
When you first asked the question, I automatically thought of Michelle Obama, so not necessarily a tech background. But I think definitely feel about her that she is leading. She like exudes leadership, this taking up space and sharing of herself, and what she says always seems deeply inspirational in terms of like big picture thinking, but also how it would relate to you. But you always feel like it's herself. She's like, this is from her experience. It is grounded in her beliefs.
Right.
Even though she's involved in politics, she's not just being a mouthpiece for something she doesn't believe in. And so I think that's always been like a real touchstone for me in terms of authenticity. When I think in tech, I often think of leaders who I wouldn't lead like, but I think they are being authentically themselves. So it's just interesting. Like, I never would lead like Elon Musk, but you never don't feel like he is being authentically himself. And I think there's pros and cons. Like, I often take almost bad examples, or some people might argue with me, but like things I wouldn't do, but I think about what about that was good,
Yeah.
right? So, you know, just because you don't share the same beliefs as someone doesn't mean that you couldn't see their authenticity. And I think a lot of the times, the examples that I see of true authenticity, a little bit actually outside of the realm of what I would think you should do. Because it's these people who live on almost the edge, who like outside the box, as we say. And so they're not acting normal. Most of us are trying to act normal all the time.
Yes.
And so I do think there's something inspirational in that, even like living themselves in every given moment. And is there something from that that we could take, whether it's what we would do exactly or not? Um, there's very few leaders in tech that I look at and think I would lead exactly like them. So in that way, I almost wouldn't. I'm sort of a collector of pieces. There's no one I say is exactly my role model because, like, I took a little bit from them, and I took a little bit from them, and I took a little bit from them. So this question is always hard to answer for me. But yeah, I think I tend to take sort of the outliers. Like, I wouldn't have managed the way Steve Jobs did, but there is something interesting about his approach, and he was always authentically himself.
I think what you're also getting at, which is an interesting point, is how personal authenticity can be. Right? What Elon Musk does as a leader is practicing authenticity, which is very personal to them. It's very individualistic. And so, what is authenticity to them might not be what it is to you or to maybe Michelle Obama.
Yeah, and I will say personally, my authenticity is very grounded in a value of respect. Do I feel respected? Am I respecting others?
Oh,
And so I am often not aligned some of especially the more wild approaches that I think can be taken in tech, right? Like innovation with no limits. I think there are limits. So I think I do bring maybe a unique perspective in tech of there's a very value-based system grounded in respect for me, which leads the way I think about innovation and products and delivery of those products. And so, yeah, again, like not going to align with everyone on that, but I can often value that they are living authentic to their selves.
Yeah, and you mentioned that respect and being respectful is one of your core values, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about how has your definition of authenticity evolved since you started in tech, and how it looks now.
Yeah, I mean, I was just in such survival mode as I was starting tech. I didn't come from a background with a ton of money. And I talk about this in my book, but as a result, I didn't even realize this until I got into tech, but I didn't really think in terms of possibilities. Like to me, it was just all sort of survival. You get in, you make a good impression, you do the work that you're asked to do. And yeah, maybe you're smart and so you do the work best or better than others. But I really wasn't trained in everything that you're doing, see the possibility, see the next level way you could bring this to life, like 10x that thinking. I really had to like bit by bit train myself on that. And I think that this up because I think there was a period of time where I wondered whether I needed to be different, like essentially not be myself, thrive in tech because the environment seemed so strongly leaning towards either thinkers like that, really bold, innovative thinkers, or really strong business thinkers. Like I would be in a room and there would be these people dismantling a chart and I would be like, that doesn't, first of all, that doesn't really motivate me. But secondly, I kind of think that's besides the point. Like, I'm not really that worried about whether it was zero point 0.5 or zero point 0.6 when we were supposed to be at 1.1, right? Like, see that a lot of the people around me in tech who were thriving were running on a different wheel almost. And it made me think for a while, oh, do I need to change? And I remember being essentially at the 10-year mark at Google, maybe, and going to essentially like a summit for women, and it was sitting in that offsite that I finally just said to myself, no, like I am who I am, and Google needs me to be who I am because I am different. And I think that that's really interesting. Like, I don't think, first of all, a lot of people get that opportunity to think about that as they're going along in their career. I don't think they're often part of an environment that would set up a place for them to think about it, but also invite them to think in that way. And so, and spend, especially, but it could be across men, a significant portion of their period of their career trying to fit in, be the same as everyone else. And as we know, diversity is actually what makes most businesses thrive. And I just think it's really interesting because there was that moment in my career where if I had just been led slightly astray, I might have thought I had to go down this business or product route to succeed. And instead, I left being very much like, no, that's not what makes you tick. It's people and figuring out what makes them work that makes you really like your work. And Google needs people who are different. So double down on that.
I think you're starting to touch upon a tone that we wanted to go deeper into, Your examples that you picked as well are very interesting because you picked Michelle Obama, an epitome of authenticity when it comes to women. And then Elon Musk, who is quite on the other side of the spectrum, a very interesting male leader in tech, very defining leader in tech. And each of them showing up in their authentic selves in a very unique way. So do you think, and if we can keep the context in tech, but even more broadly, is authenticity perceived differently for women compared to men?
For sure. And even when we're using Michelle Obama as an example, Michelle Obama is probably doing a version of only sharing a part of herself, meaning, she comes from a Black community. You don't see her necessarily. I mean, she has in her podcast, in her book, shared more, but she would say that she's likely code switching or a version of herself when in the political arena. You still feel like she's being an authentic piece of herself, but she's not necessarily sharing her whole self. She is selecting the appropriate pieces. One might say that Elon Musk is being less selective. And I think that's probably the difference that that's probably still much more in existence, both for women, but there's also other intersections, right? Black people in tech, Latina people in tech, like people with other intersections are also going to play a part, which is, can you really bring your whole self to work? Or is it more accepted for certain type of people than other type of people? And has it been encouraged all along the way? Is the Elon Musk we see, the character we see today, a byproduct of him being allowed to be himself for years and years and years? Both what we would think, I think, is the societally productive pieces of it, where he's changed the game in electric cars, and also maybe some of the less constructive elements we've seen. He has had an open invitation in a way that I think that many women and other minoritized populations do not feel, that they are sort of asked to bring their whole selves to work, but not that piece. Not the piece where maybe you come across as loud, maybe not the piece where you come across as emotional, maybe not the piece where you have tattoos up your arm. Why don't you cover that up? Right. And so I think certainly there's a limited piece, which is that if you are within a general realm of what we accept, then yes, please share yourselves and be more authentic, because everybody loves that and that makes you a better leader, etc. But if you start to fall outside of that circle, you're going to get that feedback, right? About being harsh, being aggressive, whatever it is. And so, yeah, I think that's really interesting. I will, however, self admit that I was never totally in love with bring the whole self to work, because I thought people didn't really understand what that meant. They didn't really want the whole self. They just want you to show up as like a comfortable, happy version of yourself, right? And that's very different than your whole self. And there's been notable cases people brought their whole self to work and shared opinions that people were like, oh, you should have kept that at home.
Yes. Yes.
Interesting. You mentioned kind of a specific moment in your career where staying true to your authentic self was particularly challenging. Maybe you can speak a little bit about it and tell us how you handled it.
I think there's probably been different moments. Definitely, I think there's been different moments where I had to ask myself, like in my first 10 years at Google, I was within a sales organization. And as that sales organization grew, it became more and more what you think about in terms of a typical sales organization, and sort of a little bit less of the scrappy operations org where I felt really comfortable, and more of a competitive, polished presentation based culture. And so, I didn't immediately exit that culture, but over time, I ultimately felt like the right move for me for various reasons was to pick up and find something else to do. And I don't think that always has to be your call. You might feel like, oh, I can stay and be different or whatnot. But I think knowing that overall org is moving in a very different direction than you, I think it's sometimes a really good thing to observe and then decide, like, do you really want to stay within that or should you go? And so at about the 10-year mark, I moved over to Google Fiber, and I was there in a much more product focused culture. And so that's when, again, I had this moment of, oh, that's interesting. Everyone in the room seems to really care about that. I don't really care about that. But at that time, I was like, wait, there's this great opportunity for me to stay and figure out how do you motivate the team to do these things. And so it was less at that moment of being like, oh, I wouldn't fit. They're actually appreciating what I bring. I don't need to change. And could I, in fact, make it a specialty? Could I make it a focus? So I think it was very different along the way. And, there's just been different moments across my career where I have to sort of take a step back and be like, okay, well, do I need to take a different approach? What kind of things could I do for the next, 3 months, 6 months, and see if that works? And ultimately, if it's not working and I'm not feeling comfortable, well, then I would make a different decision. Just really having the patience to observe it and understand what feels out of sync. And is it something about what I'm trying that's not working? Or is it something I could, like that I can't change really? That's just so endemically cultural that ultimately I have to decide whether I can live with it or not. So yeah, I think that's been a lot of the feeling. And I guess I would say you're not going to be one and done on it. You're not going to have this moment where you're like, perfect personality for tech. Like you're going to feel in different cultures, in different roles at different times. A company or a team evolution that it has shifted. And I find that I have to kind of constantly, not constantly so that you're nervous all the time, but on a semi-regular basis, evaluate how I'm feeling and, okay, does that mean I should change my approach a little bit? Or if I notice that something isn't working or not landing, taking that step back and asking myself why.
Yeah, I think you're talking about the fact that you actually always have a choice. And just recognizing and being self-aware that the choice exists, whether you want to swim within that stream and do something about it differently, or just change off to another stream.
The amount of people who I talk to, who I coach, who do not feel like they have options when they do, it's alarming. And I think it's a little bit how we're raised. I think it's a little bit of the environment right now in tech where there isn't as many options. So maybe you do feel more locked in. I think there's also a graduation point in our career where initially we just think we have to be heads down and accept everything. And we might not at some point realize, we've reached a point where we could ask ourselves if we want to stay or whether we want other options or take a chance on applying to some roles. And I just think sometimes that pivot takes longer than it should. And you need someone to say hey, have you keep banging your head against the wall? Have you thought about not banging your head against the wall? It's kind of nice. So I think there's a lot of stuff that goes into that, but I would definitely encourage people to just think about their options way more.
I'm sure, Igor, in your practice, as a coach, you come across a lot of that, where women specifically tend to think this is like a one-way tunnel, and I'm just going to either come out of it alive or not. I'm curious if you have thoughts to add to that. We're going to go into some of the duality questions next, but curious, Igor, on your end, in your practice, how much of that actually prohibits women from being more authentic in the workplace?
Well, it definitely plays a role, and the interesting part is that I work a lot with women from different locations and different countries, and the issue we are talking about is kind of the same for any geography. So it's common for the US, it's also common for Eastern Europe, it's also common for Central European countries. And the interesting thing is that, for example, we talk a lot about tiara syndrome, and this is something which is actually very relevant for any culture. And for some reason, I'm sure you heard about that phrase that men usually get promoted for their ambitions and women get promoted for their past results and for their past achievements. And this is actually true. So a big part of my work with women in tech is actually kind of highlighting those things and just giving them a view of another option. So it definitely is, it's definitely a challenge. And but the good news is now we know that this is a problem and we know how to handle it.
So, all right.
Okay, so another question I wanted to ask you is in your experience, does the tech industry really value authenticity, or is it just a lip service?
I think they do really value authenticity because it's the lifeblood of product development that you would truly connect and relate to your users and therefore build better products as a result. But I think that there are pieces of the authenticity that they have been more trained to understand. Still think there's like behavioral authenticity, which I was talking about earlier, where certain things are more accepted. But I also just think this lack of context, that as long as we don't really start to break through and hire diversity and get more diversity into the ranks, you just often end up with a certain type of authenticity, which is more accepted. I'll give another example. Very few Asian women and men in leadership, because wrapped up in authenticity is an idea that you would be sort of take up space in a room, share yourself, take up space in a room, very associated with male white leaders, right? And the most authentic male white leaders that you know. So you were talking about Eastern European, like, is that the same sort of value there? Especially if you look in Asian cultures, very much more quiet, respectful, speak when you need to thing. And again, so that can be misread. Like, is anyone thinking that's inauthentic? No. But are they valuing that kind of authenticity?
Yeah.
No. So you could be very much your authentic self, and no one's objecting to your authentic self, but are they valuing that kind of authenticity? Do they believe when you're sitting quietly in the corner of your room that you're bringing your whole self? No, but that's a lot of people's whole self, right? Like, they're not going to, in fact, it would be weird. They would be being inauthentic to act the other way. So, yeah, I mean, I think there's still a lot of, I love authenticity. Like, you could see, I'm like, look, it's me, woo! But it's very different for different people. And I still think that's not really what we mean yet. Like, we mean a version of it, and it's aligned with still a sort of popular opinion of what that is.
Very thought-provoking. I think there's just so many nuggets that we can tease out and keep talking about here, because it's almost saying there's a definition of authenticity that exists in the corporate circles, and as long as you're fitting that mold of that definition, you're welcome to be authentic. And anything outside those guardrails is that's an extreme behavior.
I will add one of the
Yeah.
things that I've had to do recently, because I have, in fact, been quite passionate about certain things, is I've literally been in conversations being like, this is frustration. Like,
Labeling,
this,
love it.
right? Like, I'm literally like, because I don't trust you to understand. Like, this isn't me sad and being an emotional woman. This is me being annoyed at you because you are not doing X, Y, and Z, which is your description of their job. Right. And so it's just, I do find that, like, probably other people get a pass on that. And meanwhile, I feel like, oh, I better explain it.
Very wisely said. I wonder, and just thinking a little bit more on that topic. I sometimes feel that as women, we have to display what authenticity can be and set that standard, uh, so that our teams who are looking up to us or observing us when we do not know can use it as a norm in the other circles that they shall roam in their lives. It's almost like this added responsibility. I've carried that on my shoulders sometimes. It's just like, this is who I am, and I'm fine in showing up in my authentic self.
Yeah.
And I want you to feel comfortable doing that for yourself, but also for the other women in the room or other minorities in the room who are bringing their authentic self. And so there's an added responsibility on our shoulders to say, this is what, to your point, this is labeling and saying this is what, how we are choosing to show up authentically.
Yeah. I mean, I do think we often talk about that stuff as a burden. And I do think it's a weight, an extra weight we have to carry up our journey that not everyone else has to. I've sometimes found it super enjoyable though, because it does sometimes bring an extra level of enjoyment to the job that if you were just towing the usual corporate path, you wouldn't break open with your people. I actually sort of like, it's almost like I'm a treasure hunter for them now. And I love those little moments where they see like, oh, I cared and I cared about them. Again, it's a version of respect for me, which I really value. But I do think that maybe I also remember years ago, I decided to double down on this. So I do think I'm doing it sometimes to make up for the fact that a lot tech has a very low EQ and people aren't getting this kind of appreciation from other places. And so that is like, I mean, it depends how you, is it a burden? Is it a talent? Is it whatever? I think it's all tied up for me now, but I do in fact find it sort of fun.
You know, what I actually enjoy so much about our conversation is that the subject is really important, and I think people tend to not pay usually not pay too much attention to it because people are more concentrated on their careers and more material things. But I think there might be a certain correlation between how authentic you are and your success in your career. And I think that this story has potentially might have two paths of development, right? It can be a benefit and it can be a disadvantage. And I would like to hear your thoughts about what do you think is being authentic is more of an advantage that can help you achieve more success in your career, or you should be less authentic and try to fit in?
I don't know. There's a couple parts of this to me. Listen, like there's a cynical part of me that just says, well, what do you want? Right? Do you want the fast ride up that ladder? Well, if you want the fast ride up the ladder, I would figure out what they want and I would do that. And I would fit in. And if those people go golfing on Friday afternoons, guess what you're doing? Right? Is that what you want? Right? Do you want the fast route? If you want the fast route, you want to identify the path of least resistance and you want to make yourself fit. Is that the most meaningful, valuable life you can have? Now, again, very personal preference. Some people would say yes. Other people would say, no, I don't want to spend my career doing things I don't want to do to reach some imagined level of success that doesn't mean anything to me. So it starts to really depend on you. Because if you really want that first path, then I think there's a pretty prescribed way to do it. If you want different version that's more about meaning, fulfillment, exploration, discovery, right? You just and you want like the full experience, And happiness, a version of happiness which involves that, is important to you, well, then you probably want to find some version of authenticity that matches your goals, because it's very hard, I think, to capture, to find your spirit, to find those moments in your career where you are really inspired by something if you are not being yourself. You are not paying attention to what truly motivates and inspires you. And then fulfillment will just always be a step away from yourself, because you're really either focused on the system wants from you or what other people say is a good career, whether it's your family, which a lot of us are trained to care about, or just society's expectations, what other people are doing on LinkedIn, and then you think you should do it on LinkedIn. So I have both a version which says, heck yes, authenticity is so important. Here's how it like fuels this journey in your career, which is uniquely yours. But I do then have the other side, which is you could be really frustrated trying to do the balance of both. What you really want is that rocket ship up the ladder. I've been here so long because I embraced this authentic side and was less obsessed with the VP and more obsessed with a unique career journey and finding myself and all of that. Um, you know, chicken egg, whether I'm here because I was my authentic version or whether being so long in this level allowed me to find my authenticity. Because I do think when you are doing that skyrocket, you don't have time to really steep and find who you are as a real leader and your approach to things and how you would really navigate various issues, because you're just trying to cookie print six, right, up the ladder.
Let's go a little bit deeper. Is there anything you would have done differently in your journey?
So anything I would have done differently, it's always so hard to say because, very butterfly effect. I don't know exactly what that would have triggered. I often think I stayed a little too long in my org that I was in the first 10 years, or that I stayed for the wrong reasons, thinking that I could get my org to some safe place before I left, when in reality, I just ended up being a leader who tore the whole thing apart no matter what I did. So I always think a couple of the years in there were maybe misguided. And I know better now to not give it so long. And if I'm truly not getting what I need to move faster. However, if I had left earlier, I wouldn't have gotten that fiber role because it was very timing and kismet. And the fiber role really was a beautiful stage of my career where I got to go into a whole different industry and something from scratch there that I might not have gotten to do anywhere else. Hard to say. I also think maybe in my last 6 years in search, I was slow to understand the system of what was going on all around me. Like, what would it really take to get to the next level? And who's calling the shots? And how does that system work? And I believed a little too much in someone I thought was my sponsor to navigate that for me. And that just didn't work out. And at the end of the day, getting to VP wasn't my be all. So certainly some sub things I wish I'd learned faster. But pretty good. Pretty good.
Do you think at some point it was your authenticity that was coming in the way?
In a way, but I don't know. It's so tied up in all kinds of things about the systems around us and what's valued. But certainly that I did not pick a traditional path that was well defined to get to VP and just stay there. It's probably been the leading thing that blocked me more than like a person, not like, oh, Alana's too funny. She doesn't take things seriously. No, I'm funny, but everyone sees that I take things seriously. I don't think that's really blocked me. I don't even necessarily think being like a woman in tech has been the culprit necessarily. But I think the fact that I've moved between 3 very different roles, all of them without a clear path to VP, is probably the culprit. Now, was it my authentic journey behind that? More interested in the journey than the goal? Yes. So in that way, the city is a major culprit for it.
I want to talk a little bit about support systems. And what I mean by that is imagine you're talking to 2 different audiences. One is more entry level audience. And we're, of course, talking about women in tech. So at entry level, let's suppose young women, they hear about the potential challenges they might face in terms of keeping their authenticity. And they might be afraid that they have to be like maybe another person to move through the career ladder. And another section of the audience is more senior people, who already been in game for a number of years, and they understand from the practical point that you kind of have to change a little bit to advance in your career faster. And what unites both of those audiences is that they want to keep their authenticity and they don't want to pretend to be someone else. So in terms of support systems and based on your practical experience, what support systems do you think are the most valuable to keep your authentic self?
In that question, actually, because it made me think of a couple different things. I think probably the most, I think a lot of time gets spent on mentors and sponsors. I think there is a place for them. However, what I think is, after having interviewed over 80 women for my book and now for over 4 years, trooped around and talked about the book, released a workbook, all of it, I think the most important thing is that a woman proactively at some point thinks to themselves, what's my little squad? What's my little board? What's my little tribe? Whatever they want to call it for, like for themselves, and to know who they have on that. And by the way, I would say this is gender neutral. Anyone could do it. I just think that sometimes the way women have been trained by society is to be very, 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 very good on their own, help everyone else, and ask for no help for themselves. So, more likely to find a woman who just for years in their career, and I was guilty of this, figuring it out for themselves, not knowing if that day at that meeting, it was really that they didn't speak up, or it was that maybe they spoke up, but what they said wasn't clear, or that, guess what, it's really the group. And you should talk to your manager, and your manager needs to stick up for you. And so people who navigate that by themselves, I found, just had way more insecurities or looked back on their career with way more regrets. Because they did. They looked back and they were like, oh, I should have done X and Y, or I can't believe I left so soon and I didn't ask X, Y, and Z question, or whatever it is. If you have that small tribe, you know what? Amy's great at when I get feedback about coming across as bossy and aggressive. I'm going to go talk to her to find out, like, did I really overstep here? Or does she think I should ask follow-up questions? Or maybe there's this colleague that I've seen be really great in meetings, and I want to just talk to them and get their expertise. And whenever I'm going to prep for a big meeting, I'm going to go and ask them for advice or see if they think my deck is good, right? As you just collect your little board for little things. And I think instead what it comes across is, if you don't have this magical mentor or sponsor, if you're not dating, engaged, or married to them, you're not going to succeed. And what I found more was like, it was women who were speed dating a lot of people, going back to them maybe irregularly, but just had these touch points for different things. And they didn't all have to be men or women, and they didn't all have to be even in the same maybe it was still a best friend from growing up who just really knew you and was good at pushing you when you were reluctant to push yourself, right? I found that that was probably hands down the most important thing, that they were not alone and they were thinking about that group for themselves. Now, there's a later stage where you could be proactive in terms of maturing those relationships and maybe turning them into sponsors. There's a later stage where you could be looking for specific things if you want to make a specific pivot. But I wouldn't, when you're a junior, I wouldn't even be that picky about it. Like, who do you complain to on a Friday night? Like,
Yeah.
what is that? And nowadays, you could find it online, right? Even if you're in a sort of isolated community somewhere and you don't have a big network around you, you could be asking these things in Facebook groups or other forums now and getting support that way too. So I think modern times have just expanded our ability to do this quite a bit.
Right, right. So let's go into the price that as individuals we end up paying, and more importantly, I want to touch upon the price that the organizations pay when we do not encourage authentic leadership in the workplace, and specifically in tech, where it's a very high demanding environment, and sometimes that for women might mean be the man in the room, be the aggressive one, yell the loudest so that your voice is heard, because that's what's going to be required to get the work done. But there's a price we pay when we go back home and look at ourselves in the mirror and say, was that authentic leadership? How do you, as a senior leader, a writer, a mother, and I'm sure a lot of other things that you do, Alana, how do you find that time, and how do you connect with your inner self to gauge, am I on the right track, or am I succumbing to the pressure around?
Yeah. I think that I have tried a bunch of different things. And I don't think any of the things people usually talk about work for me, which is always so funny. It depends who you're listening to, maybe. But I don't need a gratitude journal. I don't need kind of branding seminar. Like, a lot of the things that just tend to be recommended aren't my jam. Like, what I need is ongoing time with my tribe, right? Like, am I getting together with those coworkers who keep it real with me? Am I getting together with my friends who keep it real with me? And that reminds you. Like, I'm sort of reminded when people say, oh, if you get famous and you just have all these yes people around you, you become really weird. So sort of similarly, like, how are you keeping grounded, and how are you prioritizing the time with the people who keep you grounded? I have a therapist, love him, think it's great. I find it deeply fulfilling to pay someone to listen to me. They have to listen to me, whatever I say. So they often, like, you will be like, was I being weird here? And they'll be like, no, that was a human reaction. And you just get this like fulfillment that I don't think you always get from other places. Just having a medical professional tell you, you know what, that's not crazy. That was annoying. Or like, literally, sometimes you must be so annoyed. Not even like you have to ask them. Just be like, oh, you must have found that so annoying. And you're like, I did find it annoying. So I think that like getting all that grunge out, that's stuff that you would just harbor. And maybe it would turn into weird things. Like, maybe you would come across angrier. Maybe you would come across more frustrated, but you let it out at therapy that week. You got a little bit of advice from someone who deals with people worse off than you. And you came back more reasonable, right? So I love that. Um, I do think, listen, like I started to like when certain times got really rough in fiber towards the end, I harbored a lot of stress and my body just started to like really manifest it with weird things like vision issues. My left foot went numb. Like there's just a lot now that they're learning about the mind body connection and the ways that stress impacts us. And I will say that the number one thing I learned from all of that and my medical journey through all of that was that I need 8 hours of sleep a night. And if I go under that, my medical condition, like, could I have one night where I don't? Yes. No, it's not that. But if I'm like constantly doing that, it will show up. And could I get away with it when I was young? Yes, I could, but I can't now. And I will have all these different things. There's all these different things linked to sleep and what happens to you when you don't sleep. But the short story is your brain does not clear out the crap. And so you just build it up in your head. And that's why we get more migraines and other types of things. So, no, it's like very basic, honestly. And just like the stuff that people don't talk about relationships, mental health, sleep. And when I talk to people who are suffering from burnout, I ask them how much sleep they get. It is always under 6 hours a night. And I'm like, hey, you could do a lot of things, but I really recommend writing sleep. To tell you an anecdote, I had been out of the office for a couple weeks. On Tuesday, I'm in the office. I basically walk straight back into several fires. It's the end of the day on Tuesday. One of my team members walks in and I'm like on my computer tapping away. And I like, as they walk in, I grab onto my computer and I like shake it like a crazy person. And they say, this is why I like essentially sort of like, this is why you can't ever quit. Like just that authenticity, like again, going back to authenticity, but also that I was like sort of letting it out.
Yeah.
Was crazy. And I visibly show that it is crazy and that it is not normal. And I think that there's just this weird expectation in tech that we're like, we don't sleep, we love it. Like sleep when you're dead. And I just think that that's weird and wrong. And that's not how you build the best products. And it honestly makes you somewhat unrelatable. And then that builds lack of trust with your team. And then your team doesn't perform as well. And you end up in this weird cluster thinking that you have to do different things than what you really have to do. So that's my TED Talk.
Yeah. So, and at the time, I think we'll try to taper this into the closing. Just a quick question on generationally, how is authenticity perceived differently? A very proud millennial, although I'm right on the cusp of it. I always identify with the millennial side of me than the generation before me. But I've always felt that there is more acceptance about the conversations and discussions on authenticity today, and especially with the generation ahead of us. In fact, they want to take it as a given. They do not want to show up to work putting masks on, which was quite a norm when I started in my career. Especially I started in consulting, where you can't be a vivacious, vibrant, bubbly woman coming into work and telling consulting guidance to tech companies back in the day. Wasn't a norm. And I do remember putting on a mask every day and saying, this is who you're going to be for the next 9 hours, and then you can be whatever you want to be. I doubt that the Gen Zs and the more forward millennials even have this conversation with themselves about, are they really to us? And hence, maybe there's a path here forward which the generations can solve for us. Any thoughts on that? And Igor, I think your practice also probably transcends generations, so feel free to add to that as well.
I'd say that there's a base acceptance of variation, which is certainly higher than when we grew up. If you think about just the basic level acceptance of LGBTQ plus, it's like the base level and where it was when we were growing up compared to today, right? the base level of natural black hair, which is still an issue, but the base level of what it meant when we were starting our career compared to today. Has there been movement? Just so much. Just so much. I mean, when I came into tech, the whole idea was meritocracy. There was no conversation on conscious bias. There was no conversation on systemic injustice. So just light and day difference. Do I think humans change that quickly? No. And I'll give you an example, which is from the latest generation. So there was a whole generation that posted all their party photos on Facebook. The young generation thinks posting publicly is cringe. Why did they come to that? Because they know there's two versions of you, right? I just do humans change that quickly? I don't know. Like, I just think systems, first of all, don't change that quickly. And so even if this new generation comes in, they're going to run headlong into the promotion processes, value certain things. And I think that that's not going to like magically change. Secondly, I just also think systems are made by humans. And humans are tribal creatures, love some of the power they're bringing in and the baseline expectations being higher, and that, you can't ask me to work all weekend and all of that jazz. Love it. Raise the bar for all of us. But I will also say that as I've been talking to women for the last 5 years, I still talk to a lot of junior women. They're still basically talking about the same issues. So I also just am not sure I'm seeing that sort of like really generational experiment. Like, the girls in school today are still being rewarded for being quiet and studious. So they come to the workplace still bringing that with them. They're still more likely to score themselves more strictly than guys would, and expect that they have to reach a level of performance before they could be a manager. Like, I'm still seeing those same trends. So I don't know. I think it's going to take a little while, but I love that it's more likely now that a girl was raised being told they could be the boss and when we were being raised. So I do think that changes. These girls now more likely have moms who were in the workforce and were senior roles, right? All of that does move the needle, along with some of these societal changes. So I'm here for it.
So in the spirit of what we were just talking about, how do you personally, Alana, support other women in tech in embracing their authenticity? And what message do you have for all the women out there in tech or beyond who are struggling to find their place and their voice?
Absolutely. I mean, I obviously personally coach and talk with lots of women, both directly and in groups. And what I would say that I'm often telling them is to really understand what motivates them and how much is their current job delivering that? How much does it give them that spark? Because you might have a role that is quite good in delivering that spark. And so then some of these other things, okay, let's think about what to do about them. You're not being listened to enough. You're worried about your promo trajectory, right? Like, let's break that down. But if you're not even feeling the spark, what's happening there? Like, how did you end up here? Where would you want to go? How could we change that up? And maybe it's a temporary thing because of either where the team is or what your role is, or you want to finish this up for the next 2 years before you do why. Okay, great. Then we know that. And that doesn't eat away at you and you won't look back at that with regret. But have we really thought through that? Or are you just staying because you think you should? Are you just staying because this seems like the safe option? Are you staying because this is what you've been told is success? And so I think a lot of it is wrapped up often in how good the current role is for them to be their authentic self, both to feel a level of authenticity in terms of, do they feel a spark? Do they feel joy in it? But also to show up as themselves. And often they're kind of wrapped up. Like, I'm not really happy in this role and I don't feel like I fit. And so I often am having this conversation, detangling those. But generally, just also making them feel like they deserve to ask that question. You deserve to ask that question. You don't have to stay and be inauthentic. You could stay for 6 more months, try a few things. And if you can't get to a place where you can be authentic and you feel like the culture is a good fit, then you could make a bigger decision, right? So it's very interesting. I also think that I'm just really spending a lot of time encouraging women to just go for it. Like, I'll have a conversation women where they've been evaluating job application or like job descriptions for a really long time and haven't applied to anything. And I'm like, first of all, job descriptions are notoriously inaccurate. You could apply to anything and then just see. Secondly, what exactly is going on that, like, you don't think your authentic self would be enough?
Right.
So it's just a very interesting thing. Like, I find a lot of this whole thing of like, I'm good, I'm awesome just as I am, is something that it takes 20 years for women. They'll be in their 40s and being like, yeah, I'm great, finally. And trying to get people in their 20s and 30s to be like, no, like, you carry your awesome. You are good. You can apply. Go do it. And that also, it's not the worst thing to be rejected. I think somehow we're taught as a woman, men can just go out and stab things and kill 2 of them, good enough. Women should perfectly take care of society at all times. So this like risk level of then going out and being imperfect and not getting a yes every single time, I don't know, just seems to feel really different to women than men as well. So I don't know, there's just a lot going on. I don't have one answer to that question. I have 40.
That's why you are one of the most authentic leaders that I had an opportunity of observing and being inspired by. And
Thank you. Vaguely manic, but authentic.
we'll
Thank you
take
so
that.
much.
Well, thank you for being your very authentic self on the show, and we look forward to having more conversations with you, Alana.
So
And
glad you're doing this. Thank you.